Rome, August 1492. The city is suffocating in summer heat. The Tiber runs low and brown. In the streets outside the Vatican, merchants sell holy water, relics wrapped in linen, certificates stamped with papal seals. Business is good. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals are locked in conclave. The doors have been sealed, by tradition, by law, by the weight of what is supposed to happen in this room. They are choosing the vicar of Christ on earth.
The man who will sit in the chair of Peter. The man who will hold the keys. And somewhere, in the darkness between the sleeping quarters and the voting hall, a sealed letter is passing from hand to hand. Inside the letter, a promise, a bag of gold, and a bishop's ring. We will come back to exactly what those three things bought and what they cost the world.
But to understand that moment, to understand how the Church arrived at a conclave where the papacy could be purchased like a house in the market district, you have to go back. Not just a few years, not just a few centuries. You have to go all the way back to the beginning. Because this story does not start in Rome. It starts in Samaria, with a man who saw something extraordinary and decided he had to have it. This is not a story about bad men. This is not a story about a corrupt institution.
This is not even a story about power. This is a story about what happens when the holy becomes a commodity and what it costs every generation that has to pay that price. My name is on this channel, and if you have ever looked at a church and wondered how it drifted so far from what it was supposed to be, this video is for you. Stay with me. The year is approximately AD 30. Philip the evangelist has just done something remarkable in Samaria. He has preached. People have been healed.
Thousands have turned to faith. And in the crowd, watching it all with very wide eyes, there is a man named Simon. Simon is important. He is not a nobody. He is the person the whole crowd calls the great power of God. He is a sorcerer, a wonder worker, a man who has built his reputation on spectacle. And now he is watching Philip do things he has never seen, things he cannot explain. And he believes. Genuinely, it seems, he believes. But then Peter and John arrive from Jerusalem.
They lay hands on people. And when they do, something happens that stops Simon cold. The Spirit of God falls on people, visibly, audibly, undeniably. And Simon, the great magician, the man who has spent his life mastering the mechanics of wonder, Simon sees a power he cannot replicate. So he does what he knows how to do. He pulls out his money. "Give me also this ability," he says to Peter, "so that everyone on whom I lay my hands may receive the Holy Spirit." Acts chapter 8, verse 20. And Peter's response is one of the most searing sentences in the entire New Testament. "May your money perish with you, because you thought you could buy the gift of God with money." The Greek word Peter uses is apoleia, destruction, perdition, the same word used for Judas in John chapter 17. This is not a mild rebuke. This is a verdict. Simon's name became a word, Simony, the buying and selling of spiritual things, sacred office for money, the grace of God as a transaction.
Peter cursed the first person who tried it, and for the next 1,500 years, the church he founded would struggle, and often fail, to keep that curse from coming true. Here's what most people miss about the story of Simon Magus. He is not a cartoon villain. He is not twirling a mustache. He is a man who has lived his entire life in a world where power is bought, sold, traded, and inherited. He is operating by the only logic he knows.
And that is exactly what makes him so dangerous and so familiar. Because every generation of the church that fell into simony did the same thing. They did not wake up one morning and decide to be corrupt. They took what everyone else was doing and brought it inside the walls, and it cost them everything. The Council of Chalcedon met in 451 AD, 420 years after Peter cursed Simon Magus. 420 years.
That is longer than the United States has existed, and the Church was still fighting the same battle. Canon 2 of that council, written by bishops from across the Roman world, arguing and debating in the city of Chalcedon on the Bosphorus, reads like a court order. No bishop may ordain for money. No bishop may consecrate for payment. No bishop may appoint a deacon, a presbyter, an abbot, any church officer at all in exchange for compensation. Anyone who does is to be deposed.
Anyone who pays is to be expelled from whatever order they purchased. This is not the language of people setting a new policy. This is the language of people who have been losing a fight for a very long time. Because the truth is, the buying and selling of sacred office had never really stopped. Not after Peter's curse, not after the apostles died.
Not after the Church became legal under Constantine in 313, and certainly not after it became the official religion of the empire under Theodosius in 380. If anything, legality made it worse, because now the offices of the Church came with real political power, real land, real revenue, and wherever there is real money, real men will find ways to put a price on things that were never supposed to have one.
The word for an income-producing church office was beneficium, a benefit. A bishop's seat came with estates. An abbey came with farmland. A cathedral parish came with tithes, a tenth of everything the surrounding population produced. If you held the right benefice, you did not need to work. You did not even need to show up. You simply collected. Bishops could hold multiple benefices simultaneously. This was called pluralism. They could collect the income without ever visiting the parishes or monasteries they theoretically governed. This was called absenteeism. A legal fiction called in commendam allowed powerful nobles who were not monks, who had never taken any vow, to be named the administrator of a monastery and collect its revenues. The monks inside were simply an inconvenience. These are not isolated abuses. These are the architecture of the medieval church economy.
And into this system, the logic of simony fit perfectly. If offices generated income, then offices had a market value. And if they had a market value, someone was going to sell them. Now watch what happens next. In 590 AD, a monk from a Roman noble family named Gregory is elected Bishop of Rome. He does not want the job. He writes letters begging to be released from it, but he takes it.
And the man history calls Gregory the Great becomes one of the finest administrators the ancient church ever produced. Gregory understands what Simony is doing to the church. He sees it in every diocese he corresponds with. He writes to bishop after bishop, warning them. One of his letters, Book 5, Letter 57, is almost heartbreaking in its directness. Whoever ordains a deacon or priest for money, let him know he has lost his own order.
Not just the person who receives the ordination, the bishop who performs it. Gregory is trying to make the entire transaction toxic to both parties. And for a generation, it works. Gregory is that rare thing, a man whose moral authority is so unquestioned that the system bends around him instead of bending him. But Gregory dies in 604, and the system outlasts him. Here's the part nobody tells you about Gregory the Great. He knew the reforms would not hold.
In his letters, he writes about the reform he is attempting, the way a doctor writes about a patient whose condition is serious, not panicking, but clear-eyed. He is buying time.
He is trying to preserve something, and he has no illusions about how strong the forces arrayed against him are. He was right to have none. The century after Gregory's death sees the papacy passed between noble families, local warlords, and imperial appointees like a valuable property in an inheritance dispute.
Because that is exactly what it was. The Bishop of Rome controlled estates across central Italy. He controlled the revenues of a city. He was, in practical terms, one of the most powerful landowners in the Mediterranean world. And powerful landowners do not simply pass their holdings to whoever is most spiritually qualified. They pass them to whoever they can control. This brings us to the 9th and 10th centuries.
And a period of papal history so embarrassing that Catholic scholars gave it a name that has stuck for 1,200 years: the pornocracy. The word is not, strictly speaking, about what you might think. The Greek root porne means prostitute, but the term was coined to describe something more precise: the control of the papacy by a network of Roman noble families, particularly one family, through bribery, political manipulation, marriage, and, when necessary, violence.
The central figure of this era was a woman named Theodora, not a pope, not a cardinal, a senator's wife. She and her daughters, particularly a woman named Marozia, controlled papal elections for decades. Popes were appointed and deposed based on their usefulness to the family's political agenda.
One pope, Sergius III, who held the office from 904 to 911, reportedly obtained it through the violent removal of his predecessor and the direct patronage of Theodora's husband. Sergius also reportedly fathered a child with Marozia, Theodora's teenage daughter. That child would later become Pope John XI. The son of a pope, by a teenage girl, became pope, not by election in any meaningful sense, by inheritance.
And John XI was not the worst of them. Pope John XII became pope in 955. He was 18 years old. His father, Alberic II, had ruled Rome as a secular prince and had extracted a deathbed promise from the Roman nobility. When a vacancy arose, his son would fill it. John XII was not appointed because he was holy. He was not appointed because he was qualified. He was appointed because his father had owned the seat.
The German Emperor Otto I eventually convened a synod in 963 and had John XII put on trial. The charges included ordaining a deacon in a stable, consecrating a bishop in exchange for payment, and conducting himself in ways that the synod minutes describe in Latin that was evidently too explicit for the copyists to translate comfortably. John XII died the following year. He was 27.
The church he led was not a spiritual institution that happened to have some corrupt leaders. It was, in those decades, a political machine that happened to be run by people who wore crosses. And something had to give. Grief is the only honest word for this period. Not scandal in the modern tabloid sense, the kind that titillates. Genuine grief.
Because inside the corrupt institution were thousands of ordinary priests, monks, nuns, and lay people who were trying to follow God in a church that had sold its own soul. They kept going to Mass. They kept burying their dead with prayers. They kept reading the Psalms in cold monasteries before dawn, and the institution above them was a marketplace. In 1046, a German emperor named Henry III rode into Italy with an army and a problem.
There were not one, but 3 men simultaneously claiming to be pope: Pope Sylvester III, Pope Gregory VI, and Pope Benedict IX. Each had bought, bargained, or fought his way to the claim. Each was refusing to step aside. The church was in schism with itself. Henry convened the Synod of Sutri. He deposed all 3 in one day and appointed his own candidate.
It is one of the strangest moments in church history. an emperor cleaning up a religious institution that had become too corrupt to clean itself. And the reformers around Henry knew it was not a solution, it was a tourniquet, because the next time there was no strong emperor, the families would come back. The answer came in 1059, under Pope Nicholas II.
The papal election decree of that year removed the choice of pope from the Roman nobility and the emperor, and gave it, for the first time, exclusively to the College of Cardinals, the most significant structural reform in the history of papal elections. And within 2 generations, the cardinals were selling their votes. Before we go deeper, if you have made it this far into this history, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe.
Because what is coming next is not just worse. It is organized, it is systematic, and it has a price list. The Avignon Papacy begins in 1305, and it changes everything. Pope Clement V is a Frenchman. He never goes to Rome. Instead, the papal court moves to Avignon in southern France under the effective influence of the French crown.
And there, over the next 72 years, 7 consecutive popes, all French, all surrounded by French cardinals, all operating in a city that is not Rome, build what historians now recognize as the most sophisticated ecclesiastical financial machine the medieval world had ever seen. The papal archives from this period, the introitus et exitus registers, the incoming and outgoing financial records, survive. Historians have read them.
And what they show is a church that functioned, financially, like a sophisticated tax authority. Every appointment to a significant church office now came with a fee paid to Rome. The fee was called a servicium commune, a common service, and it was set at a percentage of the annual income of the office. If you wanted to become the archbishop of somewhere important, you would owe Rome a sum equal to roughly 1/3 of your first year's income, paid in advance.
If you could not pay in cash, you could arrange credit. The papal bankers, the Bardi and Peruzzi firms of Florence, handled the financing. There were fees for everything: a fee to have a bishop selection confirmed, a fee for a dispensation allowing a priest to hold multiple benefices, a fee for permission to be absent from your diocese, a fee to legitimize an illegitimate child for ordination, a fee for a papal letter, a fee to appeal a lower court decision to the curia,
A fee to have a saint canonized. Pay attention to this. The office that processed most of these transactions was called the Notaria. And the Notaria became one of the most powerful bureaucratic institutions in Europe. It was not primarily a spiritual office, it was a revenue office. And it operated on the straightforward logic of a marketplace. You want something the church can give? We will give it to you, for a price. The wealthiest patrons got the best appointments.
The sons of noble families became bishops at ages that Gregory the Great would have found criminal. Monasteries with good revenues were handed in commandum to cardinals who never set foot in them. And deep in the countryside of France, England, Germany, and Spain, parish priests who had scraped together the fees for their appointments were trying to serve communities of peasants while sending a portion of their income back to a court in Avignon they would never see. The Great Western Schism breaks out in 1378 and makes all of this worse. Pope Gregory XI dies in Rome in 1378. The Roman mob wants an Italian pope. The cardinals, most of them French, most of them wanting to go back to Avignon, elect Urban VI under pressure. Urban VI turns out to be erratic, possibly mentally unstable, and politically impossible. The French cardinals declare the election invalid. They elect a second pope, Clement VII, who goes to Avignon. Now there are 2 popes, Each excommunicates the other. Each claims the other is the Antichrist. The kingdoms of Europe divide along political lines, France and its allies supporting Avignon, England and the Holy Roman Empire supporting Rome. And here is what neither side tells you. Both popes need money, desperately, because both popes have armies to fund, courts to maintain, and cardinals to keep loyal. And the fastest way to generate cash, the only way, really, is to sell offices.
The schism creates a buyer's market for church positions. If the Roman Pope will not give you the dispensation you want at the price you are willing to pay, the Avignon Pope will. Competition drives prices down and availability up. The Council of Pisa in 1409 attempts to solve the problem by deposing both existing popes and electing a third. Now there are three. 3 popes, 3 sets of cardinals selling offices, 3 papal courts generating fees, 1 church. It gets stranger. The Council of Constance finally resolves the schism in 1417. 1 pope is elected, the others are removed. The church breathes, and then, very quickly, goes back to what it was. Because the structural problem had never been fixed. The papacy still controlled appointments. Appointments still generated revenue. Revenue still determined who got elected to what. And the men who benefited from the system had no interest in dismantling it. They had spent the last century perfecting it. By the pontificate of Pope Sixtus IV in the 1470s and 80s, the Dataria was generating revenues that modern historians estimate at the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars a year, from fees, from dispensations, from offices sold, from indulgences distributed through licensed agents. Sixtus IV, whose name you know because he built the Sistine Chapel, created new offices specifically to sell them, offices that had no function. Offices whose only purpose was to generate a purchase price. He appointed his nephews to multiple lucrative benefices simultaneously. He created the College of Abbreviators, essentially a group of papal secretaries, and then, when he needed cash, dissolved it and forced them to buy their positions back. That is not corruption hiding behind the system. That is corruption as the system. Innocent VIII, who followed Sixtus in 1484, was the first pope to openly acknowledge his illegitimate children. He had them. He provided for them, from church revenues. And under his pontificate, the Dataria published a price list, specific sins, specific dispensations, specific fees. You could calculate the cost of your transgression in advance. But this is not the worst of what is coming. The worst is in 1492.
Before we reach that moment, this is the point in the video where I ask you to stay for the final act, because what follows is the moment everything breaks open, and I don't want you to miss it. Rodrigo Borgia is 57 years old in the summer of 1492, and he has been planning for this moment for decades. He was born in Valencia, Spain in 1431. His uncle was Pope Callistus III. At age 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal.
He had not been ordained a priest. He had a law degree. His uncle needed loyalists in the college, and Rodrigo was family. Over the next 37 years, Rodrigo Borgia accumulated offices the way other men accumulate land. He was simultaneously Archbishop of Valencia, Bishop of Porto e Santa Rufina, Bishop of Albano, and Archdeacon of multiple Spanish cathedrals. He held the office of Vice-Chancellor of the Church, the second most powerful administrative position in the Vatican, for 27 years under 5 successive popes. Each of these offices generated revenue. Each year, the revenues compounded. By 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. And the papal throne was empty, and Rodrigo wanted it. What happened in the conclave of August 1492 is not entirely secret. The man who documented the papal court at this period was a German priest named Johannes Burckhardt, the papal master of ceremonies. His diary, the Liber Notarum, is a document of extraordinary candor. Burckhardt was not writing a polemic, he was keeping records. And what those records show is a conclave that functioned in its decisive hours as a negotiation. The votes of key cardinals were secured with promises and payments. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of the Duke of Milan, received 4 mule loads of silver delivered to his home before the vote. Cardinal Orsini was promised a castle. Others received promises of lucrative benefices, political appointments for their families, or cash. The sealed letter, the bag of gold, the bishop's ring. This is what they bought. On August 11th, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI.
The herald went to the window of the Sistine Chapel, the chapel built by the man whose corruption had helped make this moment possible, and announced the name. The crowd in the square below cheered. Alexander had always been popular in Rome. He was generous, he was charming, he threw good parties. He was now the vicar of Christ on earth. His son Cesare, his illegitimate son, the son of his mistress Vanozza de Catanei, was already a bishop at age 16. He would later become a cardinal.
His daughter Lucrezia received her first betrothal at 10 and was married 3 times before she was 22, each marriage serving her father's political needs. From church revenues. And Alexander VI built. He commissioned. He patronized the arts. He protected Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. That part is historically documented, and it complicates the simple story. He was not a cartoon. He was a man who had grown up inside a system, mastered it, risen through it, and sat at its apex. And he seems to have experienced no contradiction between his faith, which was real in its way, and his conduct, because for him, as for the system he had inherited, there was no contradiction. This was just how it worked. Eamon Duffy, in Saints and Sinners, notes that the Renaissance papacy did not see itself as corrupt in any straightforward sense. The popes saw themselves as princes, Renaissance princes, who ruled through patronage, war, marriage alliances, and political maneuvering, exactly as secular rulers did. The sacred and the secular had blurred so completely that many of them could no longer see the line.
Which is why what happened 25 years later was so seismic. In the German town of Wittenberg, in the autumn of 1517, there is a monk. He is 33 years old. He is an Augustinian friar and a professor of theology at the local university. His name is Martin Luther.
Luther has spent years tormented by a question that the entire commercial apparatus of the medieval church was supposed to answer. How can a sinful human being stand before a righteous God and not be destroyed? The church's answer, worked out over centuries, was a system of penance. You confess, you are absolved, you perform acts of satisfaction, and if you died with unpaid temporal punishment still outstanding, years in purgatory, the church could help. It held, in its treasury, an infinite reserve of the merits of Christ and the saints, and it could apply those merits to your account for a donation. This was the indulgence. Pope Leo X, a Medici, a man who is reported to have said, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it," needed money to build St. Peter's Basilica. The old basilica was crumbling. The new one, designed by Bramante and later Michelangelo,
was one of the most expensive construction projects in human history.
And Leo had a budget problem. The solution: a special indulgence campaign in the German territories. The agent he licensed to sell it was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, and Tetzel was very good at his job. Tetzel preached indulgences the way a merchant sells at a market. He carried a papal bull. He carried a chest with a slot in the top. He set up in town squares and preached with theatrical energy.
And the line he became famous for, the line that burned itself into Luther's mind, was this: "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." The dead, the beloved dead, your mother, your father, your child. For a coin, just one, you could release them from pain. Luther heard this, and something in him broke. He had been reading Paul. He had been reading the letter to the Romans, the Greek word dikaiosune, righteousness, and he had been wrestling with what it meant for God to be righteous and yet to justify the sinner. And one night in a tower room in Wittenberg, the answer had come to him like light through a door. The righteousness of God that saves is not something you earn. It is something you receive by faith, just faith, faith alone.
And now, in the market square not far from his monastery, a man with a papal license was selling it. Luther wrote 95 arguments against the indulgence system. He called them theses, points for academic debate, the normal form for a university dispute. He sent them to Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, the man who had borrowed money from the Fugger banking house to pay Rome for his own appointment as archbishop, and who was therefore personally invested in the indulgence campaign that was supposed to help him repay the loan. And on October 31st, 1517, whether or not the famous hammer blow to the door of the castle church happened exactly as legend tells it, Luther's theses went public. Thesis 86 asked, with devastating simplicity, why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than that of Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money? Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Luther was not being subtle. The theses were printed, copied, distributed. Within 2 weeks, they had reached every major city in the German-speaking world. Within a month, they were being read across Europe. Because Luther had said, in academic Latin, what thousands of people had been thinking for a very long time in every language they spoke. The marketplace had been operating in plain sight. Everybody knew. The question was whether anyone would say it out loud, clearly, at the risk of everything. One monk did. Think about what it costs to be the first person to say the thing everyone knows, but no one will say. Think about the night before, October 30th, 1517.
The candle burning low, the pages on the desk, the hammer in his hand, or not yet in his hand, the knowledge that what he was about to do could not be undone. Luther was 33 years old, the same age at which another man, in another century, had walked into a temple in Jerusalem and overturned the tables of the money changers. Luther did not know how the story would end. He only knew he had run out of ways to look away. There is a type of courage that is not dramatic. It is not the courage of the battlefield. It is the courage of the person who has finally decided that honesty matters more than safety. It does not announce itself. It just acts. And history, slow, grinding, contested, violent, magnificent history, turns. The Council of Trent convened in 1545 and concluded in 1563. 18 years of argument, session after session, driven by the reality that the Protestant Reformation had already taken half of Europe out of Rome's orbit and was not coming back.
Among the things Trent finally, seriously, without ambiguity addressed after 1100 years of trying was simony. Canon 1 of the 21st session. No one is to be ordained for money. No benefice is to be granted for payment. The dotaria's most blatant revenue practices were curtailed.
The price list was gone. Trent came too late to prevent the split. But it represents something important. The Church, faced with the consequences of what it had become, found the capacity to reform. Not instantly, not without violence, not without a century of warfare that would kill millions across Europe, but it found it. This is the part of the story that deserves to sit with you. Because here is what this history actually teaches. Corruption does not announce itself.
It doesn't arrive as a villain with a sign around his neck. It arrives as the logic of the surrounding world, dressed in the robes of the institution. Simon Magus was not evil in a theatrical sense. He was a man using the only framework he knew. The Avignon popes were not monsters. They were Renaissance administrators, applying Renaissance logic to a sacred institution. Every generation that bought and sold the holy told itself a story in which what it was doing made sense.
The most dangerous corruption is always the kind that feels reasonable from the inside. The people inside the corrupt institution are not all corrupt. Inside every era of the history we have traced tonight, inside the pornocracy, inside the Avignon machine, inside the conclave that elected Alexander VI, there were priests who served faithfully, monks who prayed honestly, lay people who held on to their faith without any illusion about the institution above them.
History tends to remember the popes and forget the people. But the people are the Church. They always have been, and they kept going. That matters. And this is the one I want you to sit with longest. The marketplace was exposed not by a council, not by an emperor, not by a reform committee. It was exposed by one person who decided that telling the truth mattered more than his own safety. Martin Luther was not the first person to see what was wrong.
He was not even the first person to say it. John Wycliffe said it in 1400s. Jan Hus said it in 1515, and they paid with their lives. But Luther said it at the right moment, with the right clarity, into a world that had a printing press. This is not a story about the failure of the Church. This is not a story about the triumph of the Reformation. This is not a story about institutions or politics or theology or money.
This is a story about what happens when one person refuses to pretend that the holy is still holy when it isn't, and what that refusal costs and what it makes possible. The Church had put the sacred on the market. One monk decided he would rather face excommunication than accept the price tag. He was right, and the world he made possible, fractured, complicated, still arguing, still fighting, still reforming, is the world we live in now.
Which moment in this history hit you the hardest? Was it the conclave of 1492, where the papacy was openly purchased with silver and promises? Or was it all the way back in Acts chapter 8, where Peter had to curse the very first person who tried to buy the Spirit of God? Tell me below. I read every comment. If this history matters to you, subscribe.
There is more to come. The full story of the Council of Trent, the Jesuit response, and what happened to the Church that came out the other side of the Reformation. You will not want to miss it. And until next time, hold the holy things with open hands, not because they have no value, but because the moment you put a price on them, you have already lost them.